What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering deck. In today's video, we'll be diving into a few more budget decks that I did throw together. Some of them are some interesting decks that I kind of thought of and kind of got a little bit inspiration of from what I was kind of seeing in the Magic the Gathering arena as a whole. Some of these decks are decks I may have seen in other videos that other people were playing, but I kind of put my own spin onto it just because I could only see what the people were playing, that the videos I was watching they were playing against, but I couldn't really see the true deck list. So these are just some decks that I kind of threw together that I feel like synergize fairly well. It is 4 different variety of budget decks. They're actually, as you can see, kind of across the top there, right after the mutate mob on that top row, and each deck is kind of unique in what it's trying to do and what it brings to the table. Sure, the variety of colors isn't that great. There really isn't actually in the sense that we're playing a little bit of mixture of everything, but you can definitely see there's 2 colors that kind of like come up more often than not in these decks. The other thing too, in today's video, I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm gonna get my editing tools on. I'm gonna edit a little bit more into these videos, so as I do explanations of the videos, I'm gonna be actually adding in some video footage of me playing these decks to kind of give you some gameplay features of the decks before I actually go ahead and make the actual video of the deck itself by its standalone video form, so you'll be able to get a glimpse of what the decks are about. I'll show you some various things, maybe just extended gameplay depending on what situations are depending on the deck. Overall, the decks are fairly fun. Some of the decks are a little bit more consistent on winning than others. There's other ones that need the right conditions just because they are on the budget side. I think most of the decks I think as a whole are 8 rares or less. I don't think anyone costs more than 8 rares. I think there's only one that's actually 8 rares and the rest are actually lower than that. So it is a good variety of rares and uncommons and commons. I don't think any of them include a mythic. And in each deck there will be a sideboard listing the various cards that you can add into the deck to make it overall better. Like I said, guys, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button, but let's dive right into the decks. Let's break them down and see what they're all about. All right, so the first deck up is actually a Selesnya Landfall counter style deck. Because we lost some cards from M20, we did lose a couple of things that help generate counters for a Selesnya style counter deck, but in the budget form we do have a lot of things. Sure, there are some rare cards that definitely do make the counter style decks a lot better, but there's a lot of good cards that are actually uncommons and commons. We do have things for protection to give our things various protection from things like indestructible and or protection from a particular color. The new modal lands actually kind of help the deck in a budget form, so you actually don't have to overall play as many lands in the deck, so you have more ways to kind of at least keep your mana base going even if you don't draw lands. But we take a benefit of the landfall triggers, which actually do cause us to get counters, which then combine with the Conclave Mentor, allowing us to get counters pretty quickly and pretty efficiently. With that, we also play the new enchantment from Zendikar Rising called Felidar Retreat, which is a kind of cool enchantment for this style of a deck, just because one, it creates tokens, so if we do get a board wipe and all our creatures are destroyed, as long as we're playing lands on the battlefield, we can create 2/2 cap beast tokens, so we can kind of replenish our board. And the other thing too is we can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control, and then those creatures gain vigilance until end of turn. So essentially, once this is out and we have a decent sized board, we can actually swing in after we play a land and all our creatures are not going to tap, and they get additional counters if we have the Conclave Mentor. So this is kind of one of the cool tricks with the deck. The other thing we are playing in the deck is actually Karzoon Mammoth, but not really for the main ability. I mean, he is a good 3/3. When the land enters the battlefield under control, he gets +2/+2 in a turn. But overall, he's not the best. I mean, the modal land is probably the better part of him. He does cost double green, but if we do get him out and we do get him a couple landfall triggers, I mean, that's great. But at the end of the day, he's an okay 3/3 card. You don't really need him. It's just he's there for things. I'm sure you could probably find like a decent 3-cost 3/3, or maybe add in another modal land kind of style card that maybe synergizes with the deck. But this is just a card we have in the deck. I would say this one's not as important as the other one if you don't have enough wild cards to actually finish the deck as a whole, especially the rare and mythic ones, which are definitely a little bit more expensive. And we have the typical protections cards with the LC's Bounty. We have the Selfless Savior. I mean, either or, it's up to you which ones you want to play more of. I lean more towards the Selfless Savior because of more of board wipes and that removal. LC's Life Bounty is good because of the spot removal and things that would target something, give it protection from a particular color. So that's like an alternative. We play the Vastwood Fortification because it's an instant speed 1-cost spell that is also a mortal land, as well as it's a 1-mana instant that gets a +1/+1 counter on target creature at instant speed, so you can't go wrong with that. And combine that with Conclave Mentor, it's a 1-mana +2/+2 permanently, so that's definitely a good solid thing. Of course, I think Wildwood Scourge is actually definitely an underrated card for this kind of style deck, just because it benefits from us putting additional +1/+1 counters on non-Hydra creatures. So especially when we start going, he'll start growing bigger and bigger. Combine that with Conclave Mentor, the thing definitely becomes a monster pretty quickly. Then we got the Fearless Fledgling, which is a new card from Zendikar Rise, uncommon, and it just has an ability whenever a land enters the battlefield in their control, you get to put a +1/+1 counter it, and it gains fly until end of turn. So essentially, with this and a mentor, you essentially can get this to be a 3/3 with flying. Every time you put a land on the battlefield, it gains flying again. So a pretty interesting card there to get 2 +1/+1 counters for the cost of just playing a land on the battlefield. Season Hollowblade is pretty solid here, just on the fact that we can discard a card, make it indestructible. It's a 3/1, creates a pretty decent blocker. It makes it a little bit more harder for our opponent to kind of figure out how to spot removal it, just because we can discard a card as long as we have cards in our hand to actually keep it alive. Then we got the Sergi Shelter, which is kind of like the new thing, to kind of give additional protection for a particular color, and it's also a modal land. It's a 2-mana instant speed where you gain protection to creature you control gains protection from a particular color of your choice until end of turn. Just in case you don't draw the All-Seas bounties, we also have this in there. I think this actually replaces something that rotated out, but I think this is 1 more mana more expensive, so that's the only downfall with it, but it's overall a decently solid way to protect your creatures. Of course, Conclave Mentor is the main source of allowing us to get more +1/+1 counters, so we do play 4 copies of those. Roll-in Regrowth is a good way for us to look in our library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle our library, which then in theory triggers multiple landfall triggers, which then allows us to either get multiple procs of things getting +1/+1 counters, multiple things getting +2/+2, or multiple triggers from our actual enchantment, Felidar Retreat, which is definitely solid in that sense. Then we got the Territorial Scythe Cat, which is a 2/1 with trample. Landfall enters battlefield under control, put a +1/+1 counter. So another thing that just gets +1/+1 counters every time I play a land. Definitely a good card in this style. I'm sure there's definitely better rares and mythics that you could probably put in, but for what we're trying to do on a budget, this is definitely a pretty solid card. If you play this and then play a land immediately, you know, you at least can put it at like a 3/2 with trample, and if you have the Conclave Mentor, it already grows to a 4/3. So definitely an interesting card to play when you're about to when you play a land after. I wouldn't play this and then not play anything, just because it is easy target for a spot removal. And then other than that, we do have 8 plains, 5 forests, and all of our all around just 4 Blossom of Sand, just as our splash mana to play a little bit of this, little of that. You can definitely go the modal lands route if you do have the rare cards to craft those. That is definitely something you can do. And you may be wondering yourself, well, that doesn't make X amount of mana, but you know, this whole modal land thing and modal land system allows us to kind of play a little bit less of the actual lands and play a little bit more creatures and more things to synergize the deck all together. I did create a sideboard overall in the deck, which allows us to have Luminarch Aspirant, which is a good card to add into the deck. You can always get rid of something like the Fearless Fledgling or something like that, just to allow us to have something that just automatically puts counters on something at the beginning of our combat. Lotus Cobra, because of the landfall triggers, definitely can add that in there. I mean, if there's anything that you think you could remove to add additional lands, I would suggest that. Maybe even get rid of the Mammoth. Like I said, the Mammoth is good, but it's not great. But sorry, Ket is also good, just because he is a planeswalker. He does allow us to put +1/+1 counters on creatures, and whenever more and more creatures attack, create that many 1/1 soldier tokens that are tapped and attacking. And his emblem is actually very solid, because it just adds counters to everything if we can get to +6. Turn Temblar Symbiosis is a good card in the sense that it's a 7 mana. We get this, look at the top 7 cards of our library, put a creature card among them onto the battlefield. It has the current mana cost 3 or less. Enters the battlefield 3 additional +1/+1 counters on it. Put the rest on the bottom of our library in order. Our deck is rarely on the budget side, so this is definitely a good card to get, you know, these additional counters. Then if any of those creatures do come out on the battlefield, I know it kind of stinks for the X cost cards because they're already a 0 when that triggers. They would get, you know, the additional counters, so they'd be like a 4/4 or something like that. And of course, Stonecoil Serpent is something you could always add into the deck, just because you get in the late game, you definitely can add in, you know, you can definitely spend X mana, so you efficiently use all your mana in your mana pool and play a very big thing that has protection from multicolor, which definitely helps with certain decks in the meta currently. But this is just some of the cards. I will add that modal land, so when you do import this deck list into your arena client, it will have the modal land in there, just as an idea. You don't have to craft these cards, so if you don't have the cards or to cost these, you can always remove from the sideboard. I just figured I put these cards here just to have an idea of what cards to look for, maybe to craft later as you build up on this deck. Now, as for the gameplay is pretty solid in what it's trying to do. And, you know, it's one of those things where we're trying to, you know, pretty much hit cards on curve. It'd be great if you hit All Seeds or a Selfless Savior on turn 1, follow it up with a turn 2. Either a Conclave Mentor is ideal. Making sure you have the green and white mana is very important, just because the deck is kind of like that split 50-50. You know, our turn 2 is mostly white, our turn 3 is mostly green. So as long as we have like a green mana, we're pretty good when it comes to splitting the overall land base in the deck. So I would suggest probably a hand of at least 1 white mana, 1 green mana, if not 2 green mana, just because I think the only card that costs 2 green is actually the Mammoth. Everything else is just 1 of 1 color, so it's like 1 of this, 1 of that, or 1 of each to actually cast a particular card, and just overall pretty solid curve just to ramp yourself up and hopefully kind of start going off by like turn 4, turn 5, and putting your opponent definitely in a position where you kind of take over. But with that being said, guys, let's move on to the next deck. All right, so the next deck up is actually a Rakdos build. It is a party build, which is pretty cool. I would say the party build I did make in my original video is an okay build, but I feel like this one's a little bit more aggressive on what it's trying to do, just because we are playing red and we are playing black, and what we're playing in this deck is actually super aggressive. And what we're trying to do is just essentially be like a little bit of a burn deck and a little bit of a party deck, while we're trying to do a couple other things and kind of, you know, control our opponent out. This deck does run a couple rares, I would say. You know, it definitely runs the Zargas, which is a pretty solid rare card from Zendikar Rise. It has flying, death touch, and haste, and it costs 1 less for each creature in our party. Other creatures we control gain death touch. Whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a planeswalker, destroys a planeswalker. There's not as many uncommon planeswalkers, so that's something you don't have to worry about. So there's a little bit less planeswalker currently in the meta, but you know, just on that basis, if you have one of these creatures attack a planeswalker your opponent may be playing, it instantly does it, even if it does 1 damage. It plays a couple, it has a pretty decent curve. It has a lot of, it's a very cheap and inexpensive deck just because it tries to use the party system to make things cheaper. So it doesn't actually play a lot of mana in its base pool. But of course, we're playing modal lands just because modal lands are the new thing. So we are playing modal lands to kind of keep our mana base in check. But we're playing Bloodchief Thirst, which is a pretty solid 1-spot removal sorcery spell that allows us to remove target creature or planeswalker confirm it costs 2 or less. And if it was kicked, we can instead destroy target creature or planeswalker. So it allows us in the later game to actually play for a little bit more expensive and kind of destroy kind of any creature or planeswalker in the late game. Malakir Rebirth, which is kind of a cool card. We may lose to life in the process, but is one of those things. If our opponent does have a spot removal, we can play this in response, and it allows us to, when this creature dies, return to the battlefield tapped under owner's control. So essentially we can kind of get it out of the way of a spot removal, or we can play it for the Malakir Mire as something in case we really don't need that effect. If our opponent's not really playing anything spot removal, maybe they're just trying to go off on a combo, we just want to make sure that our card stays on the battlefield. Fire Blade Charge is a pretty cool card. It's a decent 1/1 that has the ability, if it's equipped, it has haste. But the ability that is really good is that whenever it dies, it deals damage equal to the power to any target. So if your opponent spot removes it, even for a 1/1, or you block into something that's a 2/2, you're going to deal 1 damage to it, and then it's going to hit that target again. Or you can even just throw the point damage at your opponent's face. Then we followed up with a Spikefield Hazard. It's a 1 damage instant speed burn spell. If the permanent that would be dealt damage would die this turn, instead exile it. And it's also a modal land, but it's a decent spot removal spell in the sense that if your opponent's if you're gonna wake the board or something, or let's just say Uro's not in the format anymore, but let's just say you play like Uro or something, and you actually hit it for the 1 before it gets sacrificed, it essentially gets exiled instead of actually going to the graveyard. So essentially, if you hit something instead of it going to the graveyard in the process of a removal spell or an effect, this will remove it and exile it, so it actually doesn't go into the graveyard. Acquisitions Expert's pretty cool in the sense, because we're playing a party deck, our opponent now has to reveal X amount of cards in their hand equal to the number of creatures in our party. We get to choose one of those cards, and they have to discard that card. It's definitely a pretty decent thing, even in the early game, even if you only have 1 creature in a party being this card. Making your opponent discard a single card for 2 mana is pretty solid, and then you get a 1/2 body out of it, so it's pretty decent. And in a later game, even that 1 card discard is definitely hurting if your opponent doesn't have a lot of mechanics to really fill their hand back up. Then we followed up with the Malakir Blood Priest, which is 2 mana, 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life, and you gain X life, where X is the number of creatures in our party. So it's kind of like that, even if we may be not full of doing like a lot of damage, our opponent has a decent wall that we're not really getting through for damage. If we have a decently sized party, we definitely can still, you know, ping our opponent for enough damage and gain enough life to maybe stick around, or kind of finish them off just in case we didn't finish them off with the attack. Then we get the Gore-Tag Bugcatcher, which is a 1/2 trampler. Whenever it attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each creature in our party. So essentially, it looks like a weak creature, but we then swing in as our party fills up, and it just gets stronger and stronger. And it has trample, so it gets over like 1/1 count tokens and stuff like that. But I mean, it's easily spot removal. But you know, it's one of those things that kind of can catch our opponent off by surprise. Heartfire Immolator, which is a card from M21. It's a 2/2 for 2 mana. Prowess, and then we can tap 1 red, sacrifice it, deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker. So essentially, every time we play a non-creature spell, it will get +1/+1 for its prowess cost, and then we can always tap it in the later game. If our opponent maybe has a big creature, we can always sacrifice and throw that damage at your creature and or planeswalker, just to kind of for some removal. Definitely an interesting card, but the prowess thing is definitely pretty good for the deck if we're trying to be aggressive. We got the Blackborn Rogue, which is a modal land. It has Menace. It's +3/+0 as long as the opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. We're not really doing too much to really make our opponent mill, but in the later game, as the game goes on, this card definitely can, you know, hit the +3/+0 if our opponent has played stuff. And with the Earl being out of the format, it's not like our opponent's escaping a bunch of stuff to really get rid of things in their graveyard. So this is definitely something that can eventually get pumped up, and it has Menace, so it's definitely something that makes it tough for our opponent to block. Also, in the early game, if we don't really have black mana, we can always play it in the battlefield tapped. Then we get the Ardent Electromancer, 3 mana, 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, it gets 1 red mana for each creature in our party, which in the early game is a little tougher to get a bunch of mana out of it, but in the later game, when our party's starting to fill up and we have the various roles, we are now going to get 1 red mana for each creature in our party. So if there's 3 creatures in the party, we're going to get 3 red mana, and then we can use that to play an additional spell that turn that we more than likely wouldn't have been able to because we could have tapped out or something like that. Protag the Night Runner is a 3 mana, 2/3. When it deals combat damage to a player, exile top card of our library. Now we can play that card this turn, so it allows us to kind of like we can swing in. If we do damage to our opponent, we are now going to be able to play the top card of our library as well, possibly. I think we just play it. It doesn't say anything about paying the mana cost. This is the one card I didn't draw in my gameplay that you may see as we're kind of talking about it. So overall, it's a very interesting card in that sense that you know, we get to play a card from the top of our library that gets exiled. Ravager's Mace is a 3 mana equipment that is new from Zendikar Rising. As you can see, there's a big theme of a lot of Zendikar Rising stuff. I kind of want to make a lot of budget decks with the new stuff, just on the basis of, sure, there's some old stuff that we could definitely go over. There's definitely some good old budget decks from various older sets that have been out in standard, but I kind of want to splash in a lot more Zendikar just because it's the newness, and this is maybe an area where you just got into. But with that being said, the Ravager's Mace is a mace that comes in the battlefield. It automatically is attached to a creature you control. An equipped creature gets +1/+0 for each creature in our party and has Menace. So essentially, in the late game, if our opponent doesn't have a bunch of creatures, but we have a big party, our creature's going to get pumped up, and it's going to definitely make blocks a little bit harder. If our creature does end up dying or this somehow gets removed, it does have an expensive equip cost, which is 4 mana. But the overall ability of it coming into the battlefield automatically equipping to something is definitely very good. And we have the Shatterskull Minotaur. It's a 6 mana, 5/4, has haste. It costs 1 less for each creature in our party. So essentially, even as much as it's a 6 mana card, this essentially could become a 2 mana card in the late game if we have a full party. But even if we hit it on turn 4 or turn 5 and it's a 3 or 4 mana card, it's definitely pretty solid. 5/4 is definitely very aggressive to hit our opponent with, especially put that with the mace maybe on it. It definitely can hit our opponent pretty hard, and with it having haste is pretty decent as well. Then we have the Zargros, Thief of the Heartbeats, new card from Zendikar Rising. I think I already briefly went over this. You know, flying, death touch, haste, and costs 1 less for each creature in our party, just like the Minotaur. But you know, it's a little bit stronger because it gives our creatures death touch, and then whenever it deals damage to a Planeswalker, destroy that Planeswalker. So pretty solid card. Definitely something that in the late game we may have a lot of cards in our party, making this thing cost 4, 3, possibly even 2 if we get super lucky with a full party. But definitely a good card in general. And then our mana base is pretty straightforward. 5 swamps, 6 mountains, and 4 blood-filled caves. Just like I said in the previous decks that I've been going over, you know, we play a lot more model lands, so you don't need to have as many regular lands. If you do feel like you're running into issues, you can always drop some of the cards that are modal lands and actually put in more basics. Just that would be the only thing I would suggest. I probably wouldn't try to like put in too much crazy other lands. I mean, even if you think maybe Evolving Wilds or something like that, or even Fatal Passages if you have a few. I'm not a big fan of the come into play tap lands, so adding more of those kind of slows down an aggressive deck like this. So any lands that would come into play not tapped, that would be my benefit of like what I would suggest to really add into the deck to make the deck maybe run a little bit smoother. As for the sideboard, these are a couple cards that you could add in. Like I said, Fabled Passage is definitely a good land to help you kind of like fix your mana in case your mana gets a little awkward. Embercleave is very good. Just like I said, the deck is very aggressive. You could probably replace the mace with the Embercleave just because the Embercleave is overall stronger because it gives our creature +1/+1 and double strike, so that's a little bit better. And X amount of creatures attack, this will cost less. Making it a little bit cheaper, you can do it at instant speed to catch your opponent off guard. And Robber of the Rich is a pretty solid 2 mana card. It's a 2/2 reach and haste. And then the ability to kind of steal the top card of your opponent's library as long as it's not a land, and we can play that card and spend the mana of whatever color to play that card. Is definitely a good ability. But these are some cards that you can reach for, but this is definitely a good basis to start out with if you want to try out like the Rakdos party style. Let me know what you guys think of this deck. This deck is actually kind of fun from when I did play it, so definitely a deck I would try to check out first if you have the available wild cards. So this next deck up is a very interesting deck. This is actually a deck I saw, I think I saw someone play it maybe more in a limited sense, but I was like wondering if there was a way to make this kind of like a thing, and that is a Simic kicker style deck. And what that essentially means, the deck runs a lot of spells that benefit from us playing kicker spells. So there's a lot of things that, you know, have kind of expensive kicker costs, and maybe in the early game it doesn't make them that strong, but in the late game, if we start having a bunch of mana, and there's definitely ways in this deck to get a ton of mana, we can definitely really take advantage of the kicker spells like Gain of Life, making additional counters on things, copying spells, and things like that. So to start off, we do have Bubble Snare, which is a 1 mana enchantment, which makes our opponent creature doesn't untap during another tap step. But if we kick it for 3 additional mana, we can tap that creature automatically. But definitely a 1 mana tap down a target creature if it's already tapped. Definitely a good card. Then we go into the Roost of the Drakes, which is the 1 mana enchantment. Then we can kick for additional 3 mana. If it enters the battlefield kicked, we get a 2/2 Drake. Whenever we cast a kick spell, create a 2/2 Drake with token with flying. So pretty much a token generator for the deck. This is kind of like a way to throw some chump blockers, or just take an advantage and kind of swing over your opponent's creatures in the air. Next up is Reclaim the Waste, which is a 1 mana search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into our hand, then shuffle our library. If we tap 3 mana to kick it, we get to now search our library for 2 basic land cards instead of 1. So essentially for 4 mana, now you get 2 basic land cards into your hand, which essentially is kind of like a lot of the other ones, but we can at least play it on turn 1 even if we don't want to play it, or just to fix our mana if we drew like a hand with 2 green and maybe no blue. This is definitely a good card to kind of set up your next turn. Definitely find your basic lane card and maybe fix your mana. Into the Royal is a very solid bounce card, 2 mana with a kicker at 2. Turn target island permanent to its owner's hand. If it was kicked, we get to draw a card. So in the late game, drawing a card after we play this is definitely a good way to replace the card from our hand. Maybe essentially looking for a particular card that you're looking to maybe draw at the same time too. Let's just say, for example, you drew like a Bubble Snare and you want to maybe move it onto a different creature. You can always into a Royal the Bubble Snare off the creature that you may have put it on earlier in the game, return it back to your hand, now play the Bubble Snare on maybe a bigger creature, something you don't want to deal with in the late game, just something you really have no removal for. This would definitely be a good way to do that because it's any non-land permanent, it's not just your opponent. So definitely a good card in that sense. We have the Tangle Floridon, whatever it is. It's a 1 mana, it's a 2 mana 1/1. Makes green mana, or you play for its modal side, which I feel like a lot of people just play this card just to play for the modal side. I don't think really anyone plays it for the front side, but it's a land. Essentially, you can make a green by making the land, or you make a green by making a creature. Some of the creatures are fairly weak, so typically the land's the better way. We have the Vine Gecko, which is a cool card. It's a 2 mana 2/2. When the first spell we cast each turn costs 1. With the first kick spell you cast each turn costs 1 to kick, so it makes our kick a little bit cheaper. And whenever we cast a kick spell, put a +1/+1 a counter on Vine Gecko, which essentially means this card just gets bigger and bigger whenever we play a kick spell. So, and this is on each turn. So if we play a kick spell on our turn and it costs 1 less, and then we get to play it on our opponent's turn, it costs 1 less. So it's any turn that we play. It's just the first spell on that turn. So this is like the rare in the deck. It's the Verazol, the Split Current. It's a 2 mana, 1 green, 1 blue. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it equal to the mana spent to cast it. So essentially, could be a big creature. But the ability here, because it's like this is like the legendary creature for kick cards. Whenever you cast a kick spell, you may remove 2 +1/+1 counters from it. If you do, copy that spell, and you may choose new targets for that copy. A copy of a permanent soul becomes a token. So essentially, if you played this and then maybe played a creature that has a kicker cost, you essentially can make a copy of that spell or that creature with a kicker cost. Or essentially you can then maybe cost a spell in the later game. You'll kind of see as we kind of get a little bit further into the more expensive cards that will search our library for basic lane cards, put them in the battlefield tapped, and then put some counters on things, and then create a second copy so you get even more mana, and then create an even bigger creature. So definitely something cool to look out for. Then you got Field Research, which is a 3 mana sorcery speed, draw 2 cards. If the spell was kicked, draw 3 cards instead. Kicker at 3. So in late game, you can tap 6 mana, draw 3 cards, which is pretty cool. I'll combine that, like I said, with the Verazol or some of the other cards in our deck. This definitely is some way to fill up your hand pretty good in the late game, especially if you're starting to run low. Seludai Vision. Look at top 6 cards of our library. You may reveal instant or sorcery among them, put them into the hand, put the rest on the bottom of our library any turn. So in the early game, this is probably not as good, so you can always play it for the modal land side. But in the late game, if you're looking for a particular card, maybe a spot removal or a bounce spell into the Royal or something like that, you can definitely play this for 3 mana and then do that, which helps you kind of dig a little bit deeper into your deck to find that answer you're looking for. So overall, for 3 mana, pretty solid card. You can do it at the end of your opponent's turn or in response to something if you're looking for Like I said, just a particular spell to just have a response to maybe something your opponent's trying to do. Battle Again Recovery is a modal land style card. We're only playing 2 of this, but what this does is we get to return target card from our graveyard to our hand. So it's any card in our graveyard, so it doesn't have to, it can be spells, creatures, lands, whatever you may need. Or we play for the modal side, which is just a green mana that comes into play tapped. Marusa the Sprout Land, it's a 3 mana 3/3 with a kicker 2. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target card with the kicker ability from our graveyard to our hand. So essentially just ways to get more kicker cards back into our hand so we can replay them, like an Into the Royal, possibly any of our kickers, creatures that may have died earlier in the game. Just a good way to kind of get things back. And it's a 3/3 for 3 mana, so definitely pretty good in that sense. Lul's Mage Familiar, it's a 3 mana 2/4, which actually is a pretty solid blocker. It creates 1 green or blue mana, and whenever we cast a kick spell, we gain 2 life. So definitely against more aggressive decks is definitely a good card to have, just on the basis of we're going to gain a bunch of life. Then we get the Inscription of Insight, which is a 4 mana sorcery spell with a kicker of 4. Choose 1. If this spell is kicked, choose any number instead. You can return up to 2 target creatures to their owner's hands. You can scry 2, then draw 2 cards, and then target player creates an XX blue illusion creature token where X is the number of cards in their hand. So definitely, depending on what you're trying to do, you can either do all of them, or in a situation maybe by turn 4, you really need to just bounce some creatures back to your opponent's hand to slow them down. You can tune up 2 of their creatures back to their hand. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, you can scry 2 cards off the top of your library first, and then draw 2 cards, which is pretty good. Definitely interesting spell. Combine that with the Verazol, it's definitely a cool card to like make copies of this, so you can do this multiple times. And then the last card for that is really a spell in our deck is the Vastwood Surge. It's a 4 mana sorcery with a kicker of 4. We search our library up for 2 basic land cards, put them on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle our library. If this spell was kicked, put 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature we control. So essentially what happens here is if you have this and then the Verazol out on the battlefield, what will happen is you'll actually cast this for 8 mana, remove the 2 counters here, which will then make a copy of this, which then puts the 2 counters back and then additional 2 counters. And then if you have any other creatures in the battlefield, all our creatures get blown up into bigger creatures. So essentially this is, and then you get 4 lands into the battlefield tap. So in the late game, you're starting to thin your deck out to get more answers from the middle of the deck here, which creates a pretty interesting situation and probably catches your opponent out by surprise. And then the mana base is 4 islands, 7 forests, and 4 Thornwood Falls. Like I said, the mana base seems a little sketchy, but we have a bunch of modal lands in the deck which help out. If you want to add more basics into the deck, maybe remove some of those modal land copies from the deck, go ahead and do that if you feel like you're just drawing a lot of tap lands. And then for the sideboard, we have just a couple of things that you can add in. We have the Coral Helm Chronicler, it's a 3 mana 2/2er. Whenever you cast a kick spell, just draw a card and discard a card, so it helps us dig a little bit deeper. And when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of our library, we reveal a card with kicker among them, put it into our hand, and put the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. So it helps us essentially look for some of our kicker answers, or it allows us to draw more kicker cards so we can have more kicker triggers happen. Jace the Mirror Mage, because it has kicker, 3 mana for loyalty planeswalker. Kicker 2, when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, create a token copy of Jace the Mirror Mage, except it's not legendary, and it starts with loyalty of 1. So +1 we can draw a card, or for 0 we can draw a card, remove a number of cards, remove the number of loyalty counters from Jace equal to the current mana cost of the Mirror Mage. And then of course Fabled Passages that thin out the deck a little bit, fix the mana. You may notice in some of my decks, I do have the exact copies I think you should add into the deck, and then some of them, just because there's more cards that you could add into the deck, I only have ones of, and then you would just figure out what level of what those cards you want to add into the deck. So if you have any questions, leave a comment down below about some of the cards you maybe want to add or drop to the deck. I will do my best to answer them. Alright, and the last deck is actually a mono red burn budget style deck. What this deck essentially is doing, it's kind of essentially playing like a mono red deck that you would see currently in the meta, but we're not really playing any rares for the most part, other than the Bone Crusher Giant, which is the only rare. Other than that, most of the cards is an even balance of creatures and spells to kind of bring your opponent out or bring your opponent's creatures for some spot removal, and just take advantage of, possibly playing burn spells and hitting your opponent in the face with burn spells as a whole. So with that being said, we are playing something Oakham Hellbound, which is a 1 mana 0/1 landfall ability. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, Oakham Hellbound gets +2/+2. So for 1 mana, it's a 0/1, so easy to get spot removal on turn 1 if you're going second. But if you go first, this is a very solid card, because turn 2 you're more than likely to play a land, so you're already swinging in with a 2/3 in your opponent's face. So definitely a good card for a 1 mana. Fireblade Charger, like in the Rakdos deck, it's a very good card. We're not really playing too many equipments, but it deals damage to equal to its power to any target if it dies, and if it's equipped, it has haste. Shock for some spot removal. It's just an overall good solid 1 mana instant speed, 2 damage to something. We got more Spike Field Hazards. These cards are actually key for the deck because there is a card in the deck that gets benefit of us dealing damage to our opponent, allowing the card to get Double Strike, which is actually the Chandra's Pyrolin. It's a 2 mana 1/3. Whenever a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent, it gets +1/+0 and gains Double Strike until end of turn. So essentially the Shock and the Spike Field Hazard allows this to trigger each time it's played. So definitely a good card to have to allow this to get Double Strike and definitely get more damage into your opponent's face. And you can cast multiples of them if you think you're going to be able to finish your opponent off sooner. But just having those cards in the deck and being very cheap allows this card just to be that much stronger. Rimrock Knight is another really solid card. It's a 2 mana 3/1, has an adventure card, a spell called Boulder Rush, which gives target creature +2/+0 until end of turn. And then you can also play for a 3/1 not being able to block creature. Definitely a solid thing if you're trying to get more aggressive. Royal the Eruption, it's a 2 mana spell. Deals 3 damage to any target. If the spell is kicked, deals 5 damage. And it does have a kicker of 5, so if you do draw in the late game and have a bunch of land out, you can maybe hit your opponent for 5 if they're not expecting it. But it gets solid 3 damage to any target. For 2 mana is definitely pretty good, even though it's sorcery speed, but overall a pretty good card for the deck. Bone Crusher Giant, just because, you know, the stomp abilities, 2 mana, deal 2 damage to any target, can't be prevented. And then it's the 3 mana 4/3, and if it becomes a target of a spell, it deals 2 damage to that spell's controller, so essentially making it harder for your opponent to spot removal it, especially if their life total gets low. Then we got Flame Spill, which is a 3 mana card, deals 4 damage to target creature. Excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. So essentially you can burn like a 2 power, 2 toughness creature. It deals 2 damage to that creature and does 2 damage to the opponent. So essentially if you remove small creatures, it's going to deal excess damage to your opponent's face. Caswell's Fury, it's a new card from Zendikar Rise, and has additional cost to cast a spell. Sacrifice a creature, it deals damage equal to the sacrifice creature's power to any target. So essentially you may be able to do one big swing, and at the end you just throw the creature, your biggest creature at your opponent's face, maybe to kill them, for instant speed for 3 damage, or in the early game maybe play it as the mortal land. But this is definitely like pretty much a fling essentially. It's just a different version of fling, and that can also be a land. And we have Slay and Fire, which is a cool card. It's a 3 mana, deal 3 damage to any target, instant speed. Amendment, if 3 red mana was spent to cast a spell, it deals 4 damage instead. So it's a 3 mana, 4 damage instant speed to any target. Pretty good, especially in the late game once you're trying to get your opponent down, as you've been maybe hopefully at this point very aggressive into their face. And then we got the Embereth Paladin, which is a 4 mana 4/1 haster. At Amendment, which if 3 mana is spent to cast it, it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, so essentially becomes a 5/2 haster for 4 mana. Definitely a good way to finish off your opponent. You know, we got 18 lands in the deck. This one doesn't have many modal lands. I personally wouldn't play the Spikefield Hazard as a modal land unless you really desperately need it, just because most of the lands you want in the battlefield, you want them to come and play untapped. Overall, the deck is fairly cheap on what it's trying to do. And then there's some cards you can always add into the deck. You know, it's mono red, so there's definitely some mono red cards you can add. Fervent Champion's pretty solid just because it's a 1 mana 1/1er that you can hit your opponent in the face. For a strike haster. Robber the Rich, same thing like in the other, like the Rakdos deck. It's just a very solid 2 drop. You know, with the ability to steal cards from the top of your opponent's library and be able to play them for any mana depending on whatever color they're playing. Definitely good in that sense. Phoenix of Ash is just interesting. You don't have to add this one. This is an interesting card that I just feel like mono red doesn't play. It's one of my favorites if I do play mono red, just because it's a 2 mana 2/2er fly and haster in the air for 3 mana. You can tap 3 mana and then give it +2/+0 until end of turn. Or in the late game, if you start going through things, you can always tap it for 4 mana, exile 3 cards from our graveyard, and gets enters the battle, escapes with a +1/+1 counter on it. So essentially you just get it back and it's a little bit stronger from the graveyard. Stormherald is another one. It's a 3 mana 3/2 haster. When it enters the battlefield, return any number. I actually thought this was a different card. I got this confused with, I think, a card that rotated out, the one that got like instants and sorceries back from the graveyard. 1 second. All right, sorry about that. Well, I guess the card I was thinking of actually got removed from the game, but overall, you know, if that card was still legal, it'd be very good for this deck just to get back the spot removal spells and hitting your opponent in the face with them. But the last card I would suggest in the deck, just because it is a creature deck and it has creatures in it, is Castle Embereth. I just think it's a card if you're being super aggressive with your creatures. It's just a very solid card if you don't really have anything to interact with. Just giving your creatures +1/+0 until end of turn for 3 mana. Definitely a good way. And the deck plays a decent amount of mountains, so it should actually come into play untapped, but definitely a good card to add into the deck to just make it overall more effective. With that being said, guys, I mean, these are some budget decks that I kind of came up with. I will have all the links for them down in the you know, down in the description below if you want to add any of these to Arena and mess around with them yourself. Maybe make adjustments based on how you feel comfortable with playing. If you have any questions about any of these decks, let me know down in the comments below. I'd do my best to answer any questions or concerns that you may have with a particular deck. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you do, hit that like button. If you do like the new style of where I add in some gameplay of these decks as I kind of discuss them, go ahead and, you know, tell me about it. It definitely helps out a lot. If this is kind of like the way you want me to do these style videos, definitely a good way to help indicate that this is definitely a way I should go forward with this style of content. If you like that video, hit the like button. If you want to know I post more videos, hit the subscribe button, and I will catch you in the next video.